10,000 years ago, indigenous people in Mexico were becoming maize farmers. Small-scale cultivation of maize still goes on to the present day, but for how much longer? This edition of Earth Report comes from Mexico. We're here to find out if free trade and genetically modified food are about to change a way of life. Aldo Gonzalez is a campesino, an indigenous farmer growing maize in Oaxaca, Mexico's second poorest state. Aldo farms land that's been in his family for generations. He's barely got a foot in the door of the cash economy. After the family is fed, a tiny surplus is sold at the market. It's a hard life, but his 4 hectares gives him independence. But Aldo Gonzalez and thousands like him fear their way of life is about to end.
The Mexican government has instituted a lot of policies that are aimed at wiping out small Mexican farmers.
Leaders who supported a free trade agreement said it would make life better for all Mexicans. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is meant to be the ticket to prosperity. When Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. created NAFTA in 1994, the aim was to promote trade, competition, and efficiency, and create a level playing field for the 3 countries, so that each could benefit from its comparative advantage. For Mexico, NAFTA brought clear benefits like the rule of law.
NAFTA represented the first time in 70 years where we had an international treaty that was not able to be changed by the president, was outside of the control of the president, meaning that the business community, international business community from United States, from Canada, had certainty about certain rules applicable to their investments in Mexico, without the possibility for the president to change those rules.
NAFTA gives Mexico access to the largest economy in the world, the United States. Early U.S. concerns centered on jobs lost to Mexico. Little attention was given to the opening up of Mexico to North American goods and services.
Why Mexico and Canada? Most Americans don't see why Mexico and Canada should be special countries. Well, we happen to be their neighbors. And not only their neighbors, but Mexico and Canada are the U.S.'s #1 and 2 trading partners. So it made perfect sense to join forces and see whether we could compete together with Asia and Europe.
Few thought Mexican tortillas might soon be made with imported American maize. U.S. farms are heavily subsidized, approximately $18.7 billion in 2003, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
We believe the free market is a lie because the United States is heavily subsidizing farmers and Mexican farmers don't receive subsidies. So that's not a free market. That's not free competition. That's not fair competition.
Mexico's small farmers get little or no subsidies, so NAFTA's critics say they can't compete with American maize.
Some of them have some surpluses and they sell this in the local market. When they were selling corn at 4 pesos the kilo of corn, here comes the government with corn from Michigan and sell this corn in that place at 2 pesos kilo. That means through a chain of subsidies. Then these local farmers can no longer compete. What is the message? The government is telling them, don't produce corn.
For centuries, Mexico relied on farming as a pillar of its economy.
When we signed the free trade agreement, we agreed to compete with developed countries, basically with Canada and the US, on industrial production. And we also signed and accepted that agriculture, on the other hand, could be subsidized. So we basically said, okay, we're going to compete on an area of the economy where we're not very good. And we're going to allow you to subsidize an area of the economy which is really our fundamental pillar.
The U.S. Farm Act of 2002 allows for up to $19 billion to be given to American farmers. Though fewer people farm in rich countries, the farming lobby is still powerful. Globally, almost $300 billion are spent each year to subsidize agriculture. Incredibly, that's roughly equal to the annual profit of agricultural trade. Louis de la Caille believes this is a distortion of trade that only the World Trade Organization, the WTO, can do anything about.
The best thing that we can do for the world in terms of international trade, one of course is opening borders to all exports from developing countries, and two is to solve the largest distortion to international trade there is, which is the subsidies that we have in the US, in the EU, in Japan, in Switzerland, and in Canada. It's crucial. The problem is that that is an issue that cannot be solved bilaterally. I mean, we can sit with the US, and we will never convince the US to eliminate its subsidies if we don't convince the Europeans. So this can be done only at WTO. What you can do bilaterally, which is what we did in NAFTA, is to give countries the tools to reverse the negative impact of the subsidy if we choose to do that.
In fact, NAFTA gives its member countries tools like the imposition of duties to guard against being flooded by heavily subsidized foodstuffs like US maize.
The irony is that since the 10 years NAFTA has been implemented, Mexico has never chosen to use the tools to stop the importation of subsidized corn. And there is a reason for that. The reason for that is that Mexico is a net importer of corn, and therefore we, in the end, benefit from a subsidy from the US because we are net consumers.
So food produced on an industrial scale in North America is good news for the Mexican consumer, but bad news for the campesinos who depend on a small cash income to stay on the land.
In Mexico, we have 25% of Mexicans living in the countryside. They produce 5% of Mexico's GDP. The international evidence is that this 25% will move down to 5% or so in the next 2 decades. The transition will happen, regardless of international trade.
So we're talking about the government having the intention of making 20 million Mexicans who actually live in the countryside disappear and taking them to the maquiladora industry, or so that they can go to the United States as migrants.
What we have increased is belts of poverty, belts of misery around our cities. People that come to the cities and congregate around the cities living on the meager crumbs they can get from the urban economy. In exchange, we have got huge urban concentrations that emerged chaotically with very poor quality of life.
The NAFTA is not the cause for the poverty. If you look at where poor Mexican farmers are growing corn, you'll realize that many of the plots in which they do this will never be competitive, let alone in international markets. Domestically, what they are doing is highly inefficient. For many of them, it has become a poverty trap. So if we want those people to advance economically, as I think that should be our main objective, they will have to move away from corn at some point.
Will this shift from agriculture to industry be better for the campesinos and for Mexico in the long term?
We don't want the economy at the center of our lives. The meaning of the word development was changed by President Truman when in January 20, 1949, he coined the word underdevelopment. And then 2 billion people, like myself, became underdeveloped. We were not underdeveloped until that day, we were ourselves. And then suddenly we were transformed in someone underdeveloped. That to become underdeveloped is something horrible, it's very humiliating. They are saying that we cannot trust our noses and dream our dreams, because we need to dream the global dreams. And the global dreams are dreamt by the corporations. And for us, those dreams are a nightmare.
Apart from economics, there are other criteria to measure the contribution of traditional indigenous farmers.
The fact that the farmer is in the field cultivating should have some economic recognition as an environmental service. And they have to compete with farmers that do agriculture at a very strong environmental expense, with large environmental impact, because modern agriculture is not only the varieties they use, but also the amount of fertilizer, the amount of pesticides they use has a very strong environmental impact.
So is the demise of campesino farming communities simply an inevitable byproduct of globalization?
Los pueblos indígenas, sobre todo que están en el sureste mexicano,
The indigenous villages that are mostly in the southeast of Mexico are rural communities, farming communities that harvest to eat, not to sell. So the Mexican government wants to impose another model of development on them, and this conflicts with the culture of the villages.
In Oaxaca State, we found campesinos celebrating a lifestyle dependent on small-scale maize farming. Leo Ramirez is one of them. He farms primarily to eat, not to sell. He lives in a village outside Oaxaca City. He's known locally by his childhood nickname, El Tigre, the tiger. Here on his small plot, he and his father-in-law grow maize. The crop he shows us was planted 18 days ago. It will feed him and his extended family. Any surplus will be sold at the local market. But it's not enough to live on. So El Tigre and his wife Lourdes have to earn extra cash. By night, they make sweaters to sell wholesale. By day, Lourdes works in a shop she's opened above their house. Has the post-NAFTA economy inherited new problems?
We consume 25 million tons of maize a year. These imports of corn close the gap between 19 million we produce and 25 million we consume. We cannot produce more maize than we are producing. So if we're a net consumer, the consumer benefits from a lower price, and therefore we get a benefit from the subsidy the U.S. gives to their own farmers.
If subsidized U.S. corn is really a disguised handout by the U.S. Treasury to the Mexican consumer, surely that's a good thing. Dr. Rodrigo Medellin doesn't think so.
The cost of corn has gone down because we are importing millions of tons of subsidized corn from the States. And that's advantageous in the short run for limiting inflation and for consumers. But the production capacity of the country has collapsed. And on the long run, that's going to be a terrible crisis. I think this is a power struggle at a global level. Eventually, who has the power? The one that controls food. And if you're able to dismantle the productive capacities in other countries, and you yourself are the surplus producer of the world, you have a power, the food power.
So, ironically, the country that gave the world maize, Mexico, could one day virtually stop farming it. The great indigenous civilizations of Central America were built on this staple crop. Maize is still part of Mexico's consciousness. But it's not just free trade that may pose a threat. There are fears the use of genetically modified organisms in maize, also called transgenic maize, might contaminate Mexico's maize supply and its biodiversity. The U.S. currently uses transgenic seeds in 30% of the maize it exports to Mexico. Under NAFTA, the U.S. now sells between 6 and 8 million tons of maize to Mexico every year, and there's concern that transgenic genes might escape and contaminate Mexico's indigenous maize crops.
Los pueblos indígenas de México hemos elaborado.
The indigenous people of Mexico have farmed corn for 10,000 years, and we have put it in the hands of humanity without charging them a single cent for it.
Hoy hay unas pocas empresas que están diseñando semillas transgénicas.
Today, there are a few corporations that are designing transgenic seeds that are harmful to human health, and moreover, they think that they are the proprietors of these corn seeds. We do not agree with this. The security of the world's food should not be in the hands of corporations. It should be in the hands of the farmers.
Canabio is the Mexican government's commission to protect biodiversity. It's charged with assessing the extent of the threat, if any, of transgenic maize. Cannabis scientists say the threat is over-exaggerated. They found that although transgenic maize has spread, it's only about 1% and is not cause for concern.
There is plenty of evidence from several independent sources and also from different techniques that point out to about 1% of the seeds with transgenic sequences in certain regions of the country, basically in parts of the state of Oaxaca. I don't think it's a disaster, but it's an unfortunate thing to happen.
Other organizations like Greenpeace have test results showing the spread of transgenic maize in Mexico may be as high as 30%. But Cannabio says these higher figures for contamination may be due to imprecise testing methods. There are many unknowns in this debate, not only how much transgenics have spread, but also whether they're harmful to human and animal health and whether they pose a direct threat to Mexico's biodiversity.
Even now, after 3 years of this discussion, we don't know how important a threat it is. There is a concern that the introduction of transgenic constructs may affect the preservation in the field of traditional Mexican corn, which is very important for a number of reasons. It's not only important for Mexico, it's important for the world, because most of the crop improvements on corn, that by the way produces some 25% of the bulk food that humanity consumes, depends basically on Mexican corn for crop improvement, for new varieties, for new breeds, to breed in resistance of the plant to diseases, to breed in new traits. So basically crop improvement is based on traditional varieties, and losing those traditional varieties could be an issue of great concern.
Major U.S. biotechnology corporations like Monsanto, DuPont, and Dow have joined with a Mexican company, Savia, to form a research institute called AgroBio. It's currently working on creating a transgenic maize seed inside Mexico. Producing Mexican transgenic seeds is now being used by these scientists as an argument in favor of food power.
A country that is not self-sufficient in food production has no bargaining power for international negotiations. That is really the big hope, that we can apply modern biotechnology to develop the crops that can easily adapt to the conditions of Mexican agriculture and mainly the conditions of the poor farmer.
But farmers like Aldo Gonzalez believe transgenics are harmful and that traditional methods of growing maize, used through the centuries, shouldn't be abandoned. The jury is still out on how harmful transgenics really are. The Mexican government has imposed a moratorium on the planting of transgenic seeds until more conclusive research is available. But in the meantime, Dr. Escura and Aldo Gonzalez point out that transgenic varieties may still spread, either through airborne pollen or through farmers unknowingly planting grain from transgenic cobs of maize. The international community has also expressed concern over GMOs and transgenics. At a UN conference on biodiversity in February 2004, delegates proposed a declaration requiring all internationally traded genetically engineered products to be labeled. One delegate vetoed the declaration. That delegate was the representative of the Mexican government.
Who does the position of the Mexican government benefit? It does not benefit Mexico. It is benefiting the interests of transnational corporations.
The potential threat of transgenic maize has ignited controversy throughout Mexico. In April 2004, artists and urban activists joined with campesinos to hold a festival in Coyoacán, a suburb of Mexico City, to honor the place of maize in Mexican culture. To show just how important maize is to the national identity, the artists linked their cause to another Mexican icon, the painter Frida Kahlo. But why Frida?
Frida, because this is the 50th anniversary of her death. And she was a fighter. And she was a woman who loved a lot Mesoamerican culture. So this is a very good opportunity to celebrate this social side of Frida, and at the same time to defend our corn against the transgenic corn.
As with transgenic maize, NAFTA arouses similar passions.
No question about it, NAFTA has been a good thing for Mexico. We are very near to the most important economy of the world, and we need to take advantage of that.
The proponents of NAFTA promised the Mexican population a rosy future. The rosy future never came. We lost a lot of our traditional way of life. We have lost a lot of the ways people used to live. Agricultural policy is getting from the poor to give to the rich in practice. It's removing resources from the more needy to give those resources to farmers that already have a lot of subsidy.
Mexican farmers were quite poor before NAFTA came into effect. They remain poor, many of them, but not because of NAFTA. I think NAFTA has been a significant success. I mean, NAFTA was negotiated to increase trade and investment. And trade and investment have increased significantly. It's 3 times today what we had in the early 1990s. I mean, it's the most dramatic increase in trade that we have ever seen.
Yo creo que es importante que
I think it's important to protect the agriculture of poor countries because only then can we guarantee that poor countries will be able to produce their own food. When poor countries stop producing their own food, they will lose all form of sovereignty. They will no longer be able to decide how to govern themselves.
sobre qué hacer, cómo gobernarse a sí mismos.
There are many competing visions for Mexico's future. If Mexico's government is wrong in shifting support away from maize farming and into other pursuits, Mexico may have forced its peasantry into poverty, dismantled its maize production capacity, and threatened biodiversity. Only time will tell, but will it be too late?